I don't know whether we still talk of ESG in 5 years or in 10 years from now, but it doesn't really matter because this process continues.
Innovations in Sustainable Finance. A University of St.Gallen podcast by Julien Kölbel. I'm very excited to have on the podcast Dr. Philipp Aeby, the founder and CEO of RepRisk, an ESG data provider based in Zurich. Welcome to the show, Philipp.
Thank you very much. Great to have me here.
It's a great pleasure to have you. And transparency is going to be a topic we want to talk about. And for transparency's sake, I want to disclose that I sit on an academic advisory council of RepRisk, and I've also worked there a long time ago as a student. So I have some links with RepRisk, but the real reason Philipp is here is that there are very exciting and innovative things going on at RepRisk that we would like to talk about. First of all, tell us a little bit about what does RepRisk do in a nutshell? What is the product?
I give you three answers. Number one, we're an ESG data provider specialized on ESG issues. That's anything from deforestation or child labor or corruption. Number two, it's a due diligence service for our clients like banks and investors and supply chain managers to find out about such issues. And number three, we are an ESG technology company because we have great technology, more specifically machine learning, that allows us to identify any text documents related to these issues based on millions of what is called labeled documents that we have collected over the last 17 years. That allows us to provide exactly this due diligence and ESG data service.
Okay, so you use various means, technological and human as well, to find out what companies do wrong, in a sense.
Yes, we prefer to say what the conduct of companies is.
Okay.
So we also call that business conduct.
Yeah.
And I very much believe in transparency when it comes to business conduct, not to people's private life, but business conduct. And we provide this transparency so that better decisions can be made from a point of view, as I said before, investor or giving a credit or sourcing a product.
Can you give me a concrete use case of how someone would use the data that you provide?
Well, actually, we started 2006. This was a starting year with the due diligence service of banks. It's called Know Your Client. So basically, the example before about financing, you give a credit to a company, you help them otherwise, for example, with trade finance, etc. Or on the advisory side, helping them with IPO, listing them on a stock exchange. And then do you want to know, well, wait a second, does this company actually is associated with labor issues? Is it actually associated with things like adverse impact on biodiversity? Are there fraud issues? So that's how we started.
So you provide data and transparency about business conduct, and you're in the business since 2006. Now, over that time, there has been tremendous technological progress on a number of fronts. And, recalling back in the days how everything started to today, I'm sure the processes have evolved massively. So in which ways has technology changed the way you go about this, identifying information about misconduct?
Well, first of all, technology helps us to do things much more efficient. So when we started basically having email newsletters, or even have a box with some interesting magazines from non-government organizations, etc., and the process was much more random in 2006. Nowadays, we make a very thorough job that we make sure that any information you can get about a certain company related to these ESG issues, actually we can cover that. So technology helps us to get that job done, because obviously we could hire another 1,000 analysts and we couldn't do that with just human intelligence.
So when did it dawn on you that these new machine learning tools could be a big deal for RepRisk? Was there some sort of aha moment?
Well, not really. I mean, funny enough, already in 2008, 2009, we actually asked a specialized service provider to help us with such a classification tool we call classifier, because it classified documents. And by this we mean, okay, this is a document related, in example, before with respect to child labor and this company, etc. But it didn't work.
Okay.
it's actually quite a funny story because we wasted so much resources. We had so many people basically then classifying the documents, and after about 2 years we found out it doesn't work. So the promises of artificial intelligence, I mean, they have been there for a long time. I also remember in the 90s when I still was at university, this whole thing of artificial intelligence and what can be achieved, and actually was pretty poor. The first thing I remember with respect to the machine learning classifiers was image processing. That's one of the first things. Let's say you have a satellite image of the rainforest, and you wanted to know, okay, is that now a primary rainforest which had a different shade of green, or is it a secondary forest, or is it a linear structure like a road? So this was pretty much what you could do in the 90s. But the promise was always there. But the breakthrough, I think it's pretty fair to say, for most people, it became really visible with Google Translation, and that's when we really realized the time is now, and we could use this millions of documents for this training purpose.
I think the process at RepRisk, right, it involves, and maybe I'm oversimplifying, but roughly 2 steps. One is identifying all the documents that are relevant, that contain reference to a company, to some potential misconduct. And then the second step is interpreting what is actually in these documents after you've done that filtering and determine how severe the misconduct has been. So maybe focusing on the second part, how would you characterize I think Garry Kasparov had this famous statement that, after the chess computer beat him repeatedly, he said, well, he believes the strongest combination you can have is human plus machine. So in that, it's a difficult task, right, to sort of really summarize what is in the news. Is it now, was it willful? Was it by accident? All these details that come with it. How would you characterize the cooperation between human and machine in that task?
Well, first of all, regarding chess computers, you say Kasparov, was that his name?
I think so.
I think he's wrong. It's not true, because chess is something a human can never beat the machine. I mean, the first thing is pretty much the machine learning as we do for this document classification, that you look what happened in the past, right? You can analyze all these different games that took place. But the funny thing about the chess is it's absolutely rule-based. So you can actually really predict, if you have enough computer power, what happens if you take option A and then option B and then option C, and you can basically, in all these different options that are possible in the future, with 2 days computer power, you can actually calculate what is the best thing to happen. So I think he's wrong. You don't need humans at all. The humans just have to come up with the rules. Well, in most real world example, it's a bit more complicated, right? Especially when it's about text, and this means language. It doesn't matter if it's text or audio files, etc. It's about language. So here, basically, the computers get better with their you can't say even understanding, but with the processing of such information, and it's actually quite surprising that it was possible to have this breakthrough. So if you think, if you make a sentence, I could say, last time I was in France, I really did not believe that I enjoyed it so much because I remember that at school I had such difficulties with this language. That's a famous example. I didn't make that up. So the usual sense is a bit different. But now you understand, I talk about French, right? So how can the computer find out that I talk about French language, right?
Instead of France.
Yeah, because it started with France, and then how can you make the computer? How can you make connection? The way that really works nowadays, actually, the computer then goes back, so it plays a sentence forwards and backwards. You could say it this way, and they keep some information and etc. So it's amazing what is possible, but it's also amazing, by the way, that then basically you can start with one language and then basically can use the same so-called neural network for the next language, and you just have to change. You can imagine like the last layer of your network, which means choosing different parameters, etc. Then it still works. So it can go from a language that when you look at it written looks completely different from English, for example, to Russian. Works quite well. It's quite funny. Anyway, but what I'm saying is when in real life, and language is a good example of real life, because there are no clear rules. There are some rules, but usually for us German speakers, I mean, you're not even aware of the rules. You just know this is correct, right? And you could say the computer in a way is similar after a while, just this is correct. The other way, I don't know why I use this verb and not this verb, and why I use this funny ending, etc. But it's correct, right? So it's not that the computer knows the rules like in chess, but with experience, like a child that gets older, you master the language, right? But still, there's so many nuances, right? And for me, for example, learning English for more than 40 years now, there's still so many things I have to look up when I read a book or read the Financial Times in the morning. So here you need human intelligence. Only the humans can actually say, if I go back to the example before with Apple, that here Apple is really mentioned as a company that allegedly has a bad conduct with respect to their supply chain. Because it could well be that the article is about Apple and then it mentions another company, let's say Dell, just to be mean to Dell, and then they say, okay, Dell actually it is very bad with supply chain, but Apple on the other hand is great. It's not a real example, but you get the idea. Only humans and basically see that this article is all positive. So for example, in this sentiment analysis I mentioned before, they probably wouldn't even pick the article if you just make it based on sentiment analysis on machine learning. Yes, but sentiment analysis wouldn't even pick the article. But when you had taken it, then basically, then you would wrongly assume that Apple was mentioned in a negative way. So that's why you always need the humans for quality assurance and for interpretation and or confirmation of interpretation. To be clear, because what you do is completely rule-based. And the other thing is to produce more of this raw material that you can then feed back to the computer that you call training data sets.
In that respect, with training, of course, you had a great resource to use based on the, I don't know, thousands or hundreds of thousands of documents that you had already classified at that point. It often strikes me that of course, they are absolutely amazing advances in the technology of natural language processing, but then at the end of the day, value accrues often to those that already have the great training data sets or simply have access to data troves, such as the Amazon and Facebook. They just know a lot about people, and that's when machine learning becomes really, really interesting.
Very, very true. If I just can add something here for those less familiar with machine learning. So nowadays, the data are so important. Well, the 90s I mentioned before about image processing on classifications regarding single pixels, which are pointed in the picture. At that time, the problem was one of the problems was computer power. So when I, as a PhD student, made a mistake in the program, there was a semicolon too much or something. Next morning it came in, everything was for nothing. I basically could drink coffee the whole day and then run the whole program again overnight. So computer power was a big problem. The second actually is what is different nowadays. Now all these algorithms are for free. So Google, Facebook, all these companies actually provide you the software for free. Isn't that absolutely unbelievable? So the only thing that confines you in getting good results are this labeled data. And labeled data means, in our case, for example, you have a document, let's say a newspaper article in Korean, and it's linked to certain labor issues. But you need thousands of them. But actually already in 2015, we already had 8 million labeled documents.
Wow. Yeah, so that's also what I observe, and I thought was very exciting in the case of RepRisk, that there was not just the technology there at this point, but also a real basis of human grade classified documents that the machines can then learn from. So I'm sure there was a time period in which you experimented with these new tools and explored how you could integrate them in the existing workflow. So in between this time when it came up and it became clear that this actually does work, and now, how has it affected the analysis process?
Well, it's completely different. But let me first say that the amazing thing is that with this filtering I said before on the sentiment analysis, actually you could achieve quite amazing results. It just became impossible to do the same way when we all of a sudden had 23 languages and about 500,000 documents a day. So it works very well with human intelligence. It's just very work intensive. And nowadays, even though we have the biggest number of analysts in our company history, about 150, we still can use them for different purposes. And one of the things is that we recently, for example, is that we also combine now this data with a completely different data sets, which is geospatial data. So, for example, if in a text document it said a company built a mine, let's say a gold mine somewhere in the jungle in Peru, and this is associated with some, violations with respect to private security companies, just an example, then we could also pin down this very mine in terms of the GPS coordinates and see, do we get additional information? For example, do we get information that this mine is also just next to a protected area? And this also, again, needs a human input, especially when you set it up. Because for projects, for example, one thing is, what is the name of the project? How can you identify that? As soon as you have a database linked with GPS coordinates, it seems like an easy thing. But to link that to our database that we built over the last 17 years, there's no way you can match that. So that's another example where you need human analysis. So the work will never run out in terms of human analysis, but it's very different nowadays. So nowadays, our analysts just touch, I don't know, maybe 800,000 documents a day. So very, very few.
And wait, 800,000 they touch? That seems like a lot.
Wait, it's no, 800. So 800 to 1,000. Thanks for asking. Yes. There are about 500,000 coming in, and then 800. I don't even know the latest numbers. They really have they touch, which means that they do anything with it. So it's a huge reduction in scope, I want to say. But they don't run out of work because of obviously we combine that with new data. And in addition, what I said before, we add new languages. Whenever you add new languages, it's a lot of work to see what the machine learned actually automatically by going from one language to another, whether this actually works. And then you have to generate again this treasure of data that you can do the machine learning with. So the human analysis is always important, always there, but it changes the way people do the work.
I'd like to touch upon another subject, and that is, it doesn't sound as innovative on the face of it, but transparency, I believe, is really quite a profound innovation in the greater, let me say, socio-political context and business conduct. So specifically to RepRisk, there are, of course, many ESG data providers out there, but you found a niche, which is really this, I would call it the creation or the sort of, basically create or bring transparency to the business conduct of firms local, but also very far away, large and small, really sort of to create this visibility of what companies are doing at the other end of the world. Is that a fair characterization of what it's fundamentally about?
Fully agree. That's also actually our mission. So our mission is provide this transparency on business conduct. So basically that companies and businesses get accountable and they basically can help to make a better world, contribute to that the world gets better. So that's actually so fundamental that it's really our mission. And I think in addition to transparency, that is really changing business conduct, in my view, in a positive way. The other thing is that they are changing expectations from what is called stakeholders. And stakeholders is really shareholders. I mean, I mentioned the investors before, but also employees, academics, you could call tangential stakeholders because they're not directly related to the business of a company, but they can have an influence. So the combination of these two things, the transparency and the increasing expectations from stakeholders, that's really driving change. And I don't know whether we still talk of ESG in 5 years or in 10 years from now, but it doesn't really matter because this process continues. And ESG in this sense started long before 2018-19 when it became rather popular. I mean, the term is a bit older, but started, for example, already when I still was working in the pharmaceutical industry. And I could do many things that would be considered as corruption nowadays. For example, inviting someone, a medical doctor, to a conference with their partner, business class. I mean, that's nowadays corruption. So here, the example is not transparent. The example is different expectations, right? And the other thing in the pharmaceutical industry that I found so fascinating is nowadays all the clinical trials and the corresponding results are actually available for everyone. So there's transparency about that. And this is because there was a scandal more than 15 years ago about one drug that had very adverse side effects. So basically, then again, the transparency combined with the expectations of stakeholders has fundamentally changed the pharmaceutical industry. Fundamentally, it's a very different business. It's still about innovation and improving the patients' lives, but the way it's done, it's fundamentally different. Not only the way the sales and marketing is done, the commercial operations, but even the way research is done. So this, I think, changes the way we do business. Businesses behave, conduct, and that's why I believe this mission is so important.
And I think it goes in lockstep, right? The expectations can only change if you know about it. And many things, maybe still today, but certainly back then, just happened somewhere that you wouldn't necessarily find out about. And at the same time, if conduct is, if it's in line with expectations, it's not news. It only becomes news when it somehow violates expectations that others might reasonably have. I mean, there are limits probably to transparency as well, right? If it just stops with transparency and we're all, in this day and age overloaded a bit with information, then we still need action beyond that, I think, to really change things. But in my view, it's an essential piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. But coming back to what you said before, I think it's still the case. And we always have a little bit of feeling that this is accelerating, that also expectations are changing. I mean, great example is a Me Too movement. So it's not only that we lack transparency about behavior about certain people in Hollywood. I mean, even in Switzerland, it was well known that some people in Hollywood don't behave necessarily the way you would expect them to behave, and this was somehow accepted. So there was some transparency here. But then in 2017, everything got changed, right? And another example that actually rather proves your point or gives evidence of viewpoints is human rights. For also generation of my parents born before or in the war, they had very similar view on human rights, right? But there was no transparency. I mean, we didn't know what Swiss mining companies did in Congo or in Latin America, etc. So I think both trends are important. And as I said, sometimes I think that the change in stakeholder expectations is even accelerating. But both are important for companies' perspectives. And the thing is now, because there's so much transparency nowadays because of technology, and everyone has a mobile phone, and you can take photos of bad workplace conditions, or you can record conversations at work, etc. It's increasingly important. We haven't talked about this one aspect to find out what information really matters, right, or what data really matters, so that it becomes intelligence that you can act upon. So the whole question of quantification and metrics, and I just mentioned that because we do data science, first of all, because we do machine learning, but we also do data science because we develop metrics that help us to see certain patterns with respect to this business conduct, which then helps our clients to come to the right conclusions.
What is that metric? How does it work?
Well, there are several of them depending on the purpose. I mean, we started, the name of the company is RepRisk, that stands for reputational risk. And the first metric we did was a reputational risk metric. So basically we could say, okay, there's an increasing risk associated with the company that if a certain conduct actually gets a bigger attention, that these guys run into trouble. And this is possible because we detect what we call such ESG risk incidents in as I said, in a lot of languages, and also at the local level. Let's say that we have a local newspaper, a local NGO identify something, and if this then all of a sudden gets covered by the Wall Street Journal or any other important newspaper, then this specific conduct might perceive to be very, very negatively for the company, and then it takes a reputation hit. So we try to quantify this, for example. And then what is increasingly important for our clients is a compliance aspect. Let's say that you're a pension fund or a sovereign state fund and you have certain expectations with respect to the companies you invest in. Let's say, for example, no forced labor. And then we quantify based on what companies really do. Obviously, it's all about what companies do, not their policies, etc. Are there cases of forced labor? Is it actually systematic? Does it cover many people, etc.? So this is what we call a violator metric, because it's about a violation of an internal policy or then of a international standards like a ILO standard, International Labour Organization, or human rights statements, etc.
But to be clear, so if you take information from a local newspaper or even it might be an NGO blog, right? You don't do a fact check on this story, right? It's more a signal. Somebody said company X did Y.
Absolutely, and therefore it's very important. What source is it?
Yeah,
we cannot say whether sources are true or not in terms of what they report on, but we can say how important they are. So in the case of the Wall Street Journal I mentioned before, I mean, even if there's a fake allegation, this bad reputation resulting from that, this perception is reality, right? So basically, we look at the sources, but we also look basically, are there several sources reporting on that? And for the NGOs, non-government organizations, and newspaper outlets, etc., there's also a certain economy behind it. You know, it's usually in the environmental, social governance space not worth the effort to report on something that is absolutely untrue. That's not politics, where basically you try sometimes to come up with any dirt you can invent. But there's so much, you could say, bad conduct going on in the business world. It's absolutely no reason that you invent something, right? So the question is what you focus on. And that's hugely unfair, don't get me wrong. So usually big multinationals, Western multinationals, they get blamed for many, many things, so that investors and others actually pay attention to that. But the NGOs usually don't have to invent stuff. So for that reason, it's quite different to the political space. And when you then have smart metrics to find out is something systematic, does it actually happen again after a certain time frame? We have here a rule we call the 6-week rule. It's a 6-week rule because 7 times 6 is 42, and we know that 42 is the answer to everything. But joking aside, if something gets repeated after 6 weeks, it's a pretty good indication that that something is really happening on the ground. Because when you see how the media world functions, usually something gets reported maybe in a local newspaper, then big newspapers pick it up, but then the other local or state newspapers actually then pick up what the big media outlet actually just published. And then it takes 2-3 weeks if it's really a big story, and then it becomes calm again, I want to say, becomes quiet again. Except it's what you call a story development. So maybe more people are dying, or the new revelations, etc. Or it's really something that happens all the time. And that's the sort of signals we want to pick up.
Now, you've already explained a bit how it works, you know, the 6-week rule and that there's a quantitative score. Obviously, there are many reasonable ways in which you could compute such a score. You could take 70 weeks, right, or or any other number. Indeed. So one thing I found remarkable that 1 year ago you came out and said, okay, we want to be relatively aggressively transparent about the methodology itself. So why did you decide to do that? There were risks involved in doing that as well, weren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, what you said about our methodology is true. I mean, this is it's not random because it's based on evidence that we have this 6-week rule, but you could also take 5 weeks. Why not? Will probably also work. The key thing is that we have never changed the methodology. So basically, this is how our data set is created, right? So if something happens again, we're not interested in this specific incident if it's covered already, except it's a source escalation, so it's a local thing, but it's a global or a state thing, or we have a store expansion I mentioned before. But if one specific source mentions something and then 5 weeks later something happens again, then exactly the same story, we don't cover it. If it's 6 weeks later, we cover it. So that's how we generate the data set. And there are always decisions involved here, how you generate the data set. On the metric side, anyway, we're fully transparent. We have something you call Jupyter notebooks, so basically you can download the code together with the data and can then play around with this. You can even change the parameters, etc.
So this is anyone could go and do that and play with it?
Anyone can do that. I mean, there's of course a limited data set because the data is real gold. But if you go to our website and then something called the RepRisk Lab, then you find this Jupyter notebooks, and then you find all the metrics, and you find all the algorithm how to calculate it, but also the corresponding data for some example companies, and the corresponding what they call the attribute that you can play around with. Yes.
And this is the original algorithm as it's used internally.
Well, it's original in the sense that the RepRisk index I meant before, yes, that's the original one. This goes back to 2007. And then we have many others. There's a Violator Index, UN Global Compact, we have country indices, etc. But going back basically to what you called, how did you call it? A relative aggressive transparency. That's a good term, a new academic term. Actually, we're not really aggressive transparent, we're aggressive transparent. So we're fully transparent because this is one of the big problems of the ESG industry. The ESG industry gets a bit of a bad name because it has happened very often in the past that data got backfilled, for example. That the methodology could change not only every year and in a public way, but even within a year. And then there were academics then did back tests and thought, oh, that's a great signal here for, I don't know, a trading signal and whatever. But it's complete rubbish because at this point in time, this data were not available like that, or the methodology were changed, or the way you collect and come up with metrics in future it will be different, and it's not comparable to the past, right? So I think transparency is a huge issue in the ESG industry, and here we just said, anyway, transparency is our mission, so let's be very aggressive, not relative aggressive, very aggressive, and be fully transparent about that. And of course, not all ESG data providers can follow this example because it would be very embarrassing. But quite honestly, I enjoy putting some pressure on everyone. So this is going to be the gold standard.
So I respect that, because this is what, if it's also a signal, even if people don't themselves look at the methodology as such, knowing that it's out there is a good signal, because you expose yourself to that, and I think it was and is a bold move, and I certainly hope that others will follow suit, because I agree with you. The ESG data and rating industry has nowadays a reputation problem because there have been these cases of misconduct, let me say. I wouldn't necessarily think that they are super pervasive. I think there are a lot of people working in this industry, including in your company, who really, they believe in the mission, and they do this also for a reason, that they want to work for the better world, be part of the solution, and so forth. But it is important to to be, and I like this term, to be specific about the data generation process. Like, really, what does the data actually tell you? How was it produced? This is important to base, really information-based decisions on it. No, I completely agree. I think one potentially, I don't know, how do you deal with that? So the news media also has not a flawless reputation, let me say. So there are cases where things are not reported on. There are cases where maybe things are not invented. But as you mentioned, obviously, if Nestle does something wrong, this is big news because everybody knows Nestle, everybody eats it every day. So it's close to the heart, and for an editor of a newspaper, it's obvious that you would include that. vis-a-vis a news about some business-to-business company who produces steel that nobody has ever heard of, and so it's not news. So how does that affect the interpretation of what, let's say, the RRI would tell us? Or
well, for the reputation risk index, RRI actually it doesn't try to correct for that, because that's what it is. I mean, a good example is Nestle versus the world's biggest chocolate producer. What is actually the world's biggest chocolate producer? It's not Nestle. It's actually a company.
It's Barry Callebaut, isn't
Barry
it?
Callebaut, and
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure most people who listen to that have never heard of this company, because it's B2B, business to business, what Julian said. So they have a inherently low reputation risk. So we don't correct for that. But for some of the other metrics that we have, we actually look at company size. We look where is a company actually headquartered, where do they operate, because in different countries you have different levels of transparency. So you can actually correct for these factors. So this is one of these data science things we do. So actually, how do certain things correlate? So we didn't talk about that yet, but for each incidence, we have different levels of severity. Is it a very bad form of child labor, many children affected, etc., etc.? Is it systematic or intentional? And you can actually see that for this different, as I said before, attributes actually, and the number of incidents, there's a correlation with company headquarters, company size, where they operate, etc. So you can correct for that. But it's very, very important. We do decision support. We don't do very consciously what some people call the ESG rating, that says, okay, this is a good company, a bad company, this is a sustainable company, this is an unsustainable company. We don't do that. So we basically tell people there's a big risk that this company is violating, for example, United Nations Global Compact principles, or actually is violating the spirit, at least, of certain SDGs. So it's up to the experts then to use that data, and not that we say we know whether a company is good or bad.
Does it happen that companies call at your office and complain that they have a bad RepRisk score?
Yes, it has happened. but I don't say what companies. But it's also a good thing, and that we usually then can engage with these companies, and sometimes it's really with evil attempt, that basically that they want to sue us or threat us, etc. But very often, actually, they're very good conversations about it, especially when we explain the methodology and then say we're not judgmental in this sense.
Yeah, right. Okay, so maybe to finish it off, you've been through a lot, financial crises, technological disruptions with your company. And, I'm happy to say that it seems you and the company are doing well. But what do you foresee for the, for your business or for the ESG field in general in the coming year? What do you see coming up as sort of potential challenges or big things that we'll deal with?
Well, let me say what I wish will happen. I mean, first of all, I hope also when it comes to regulation, there's much less focus on this company self-reporting, because it's a huge administrative burden, and I'm not sure whether it helps so much when you basically try to report on things like labor issues and corruption and how you cut down the rainforest. The reporting helps, on the other hand, for everything related to carbon emissions. But I hope there's much less focus on reporting. Then the other thing I really hope to happen is that there are more and more experts in the field that really understand how to use ESG data, which also means that then we don't need something like a ESG rating anymore, because you really make intelligent decisions based on the data that suit the specific case. And the third thing is, as I think, that really focus in especially in the ESG investing side on where we actually can change things to the good. So I think, and that's a controversial opinion, it's good to end this podcast with something controversial. I think we should not focus very much on this whole transitioning to a low carbon economy. Because as investor, for example, you look at your portfolio and the whole climate problematic, that's a systemic issue, right? So it doesn't matter what your carbon footprint of your portfolio is. It happens actually at a global level. So if you just invest in one company, not the others, no change. If a company goes private or sells certain assets, there's no change. So I really think that we realize that this whole climate issue, which is close to my heart because I'm a climatologist, is really mainly for politics and regulation and carbon pricing and things like that. Well, ESG is really great in driving positive change when it comes to business conduct.
Thank you so much, Philipp, for being on the show. Well, I hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Innovations in Sustainable Finance, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Julien Kölbel.